The steam from the espresso machine hissed like incoming mortar fire as Marcus Thompson stood frozen, his coffee cup trembling in his weathered hands. 24-year-old Tyler Brooks reached across the counter to hand him extra napkins, his sleeve rolling back just enough to reveal the ink that changed everything. A wolf's head with crossed rifles underneath. And below that, the letters that made Mac's blood run cold. BRAVO7. The same unit designation Mac had carried home in a body bag 12 years ago, along with a promise to a dying soldier that he'd never been able to keep. Until now. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The October morning air carried the first bite of approaching winter as Marcus Thompson pushed through the glass doors of Riverside Coffee Co. His worn leather jacket hung loose on his shoulders, and his graying beard couldn't quite hide the scar that ran from his left ear to his jawline. At 45, Mac moved with the deliberate caution of someone who'd learned that comfort was temporary and safety was an illusion. The familiar ache in his right leg, courtesy of shrapnel that doctors had given up trying to extract, reminded him with each step that some wounds never truly heal. The coffee shop buzzed with the controlled chaos of morning rush hour. College students hunched over laptops, their textbooks creating fortresses around tiny tables. Business professionals checked phones while impatiently tapping credit cards against the counter. The scent of freshly ground beans mixed with the sweet aroma of cinnamon pastries, creating an atmosphere that should have been comforting. For most people, it was. For Mac, it was just another place to blend in, another spot where he could be invisible among the crowd of people too busy with their own lives to notice the quiet man who always ordered the same thing. Behind the counter, Tyler Brooks worked with the efficient rhythm of someone who'd mastered the art of the morning rush. His sandy brown hair fell across his forehead as he steamed milk, and his easy smile never wavered, even when customers grew impatient. At 24, he possessed the kind of natural warmth that made regulars feel like old friends and newcomers feel welcome. He wore the standard Riverside Coffee uniform, a forest green polo shirt and dark jeans. But there was something in his posture, a straightness to his shoulders that suggested discipline learned somewhere beyond customer service training. Mac had been coming to this coffee shop for 3 months, ever since he'd moved to Millbrook after another sleepless stretch in the last town had worn him too thin. He always ordered the same thing, a large black coffee, no sugar, no cream, and he always left exact change. The routine was important. Routines kept the ghosts at bay, kept the memories from crawling out of the dark corners where he'd carefully stored them. Tyler had served him dozens of times, always with that same genuine smile, always with a, "Have a great day, sir," that sounded like he actually meant it. This morning started like all the others. Mac stood in line behind a woman juggling a screaming toddler and a businessman who spoke too loudly into his phone about quarterly projections. The familiar sounds washed over him like white noise, predictable and safe. When his turn came, Tyler looked up with recognition and that trademark smile. "Morning, Marcus. Large black coffee?" Mac nodded, pulling crumpled bills from his pocket. It was then that Tyler reached across the counter to straighten the tip jar, his sleeve pulling back just enough to reveal the edge of something dark on his forearm. For a split second, Mac caught a glimpse of ink, but Tyler's movements were quick, efficient, and the moment passed before Mac could process what he'd seen. The coffee shop had its regulars, and Mac had learned to recognize the patterns. Mrs. Helen Carter came in every Tuesday and Thursday at exactly 8:15, ordering a small decaf with 2 sugars, while she shared photos of her grandchildren with whoever would listen. Tom Wilson, the firefighter, stopped by after his overnight shifts, usually around 7:30, always ordering an extra-large espresso because, as he'd joked to Tyler, "I need to stay awake long enough to remember where I live." Then there were the others, the ones Mac tried to avoid, like Brad Mitchell, who worked at some finance firm downtown and treated every interaction like a negotiation he was determined to win. Brad had the kind of aggressive confidence that came from never having been truly tested, never having learned that bravado was just fear wearing expensive clothes. He'd roll in around 8 o'clock with his girlfriend Jessica, a social media influencer who documented their coffee runs like they were exotic expeditions. They were the type who complained about wait times, demanded modifications to menu items, and generally treated the staff like they were inconveniences rather than people. This particular morning, Brad and Jessica arrived right on schedule, bringing with them their usual cloud of entitlement and noise. Brad wore a perfectly pressed shirt that probably cost more than Tyler made in a week, and Jessica clutched her phone like a lifeline, already composing what would undoubtedly become a story about authentic local coffee culture. "Excuse me," Brad called out before he'd even reached the counter, his voice cutting through the morning chatter. "Is there any way we can get priority service? We've got a meeting we absolutely cannot miss." Tyler maintained his professional smile. "I'll get you taken care of as quickly as possible, but I need to finish up with the customers ahead of you first." "Come on, man," Brad pressed, his tone suggesting that reason should obviously prevail over fairness. "We're talking 5 minutes here. These people are probably retired anyway." The elderly woman ahead of Brad turned around, her expression a mixture of surprise and indignation. "Excuse me, young man, but I believe the line works the same way for everyone." Jessica looked up from her phone long enough to roll her eyes. "It's not personal, it's just practical. Some people have places to be." Mac watched the exchange from his usual spot near the window, his coffee growing cold in his hands. He'd seen this kind of behavior before, in different uniforms and different countries, but the core was always the same. People who'd never learned that respect was earned, not bought. People who confused volume with authority and presumed that their comfort mattered more than other people's dignity. The tension at the counter was building, and other customers were starting to take notice. A young woman with a laptop looked up from her screen, frowning at the disruption. 2 men in construction gear exchanged glances that suggested they were about ready to say something. But Tyler handled it with the kind of grace that spoke to experience dealing with difficult people. "I totally understand you're in a hurry," Tyler said, his voice calm but firm. "But fairness is important to us here, and everyone's time matters equally. I promise I'll have you out of here as fast as possible once it's your turn." Brad's face reddened slightly, but before he could escalate further, his friend Connor Hayes walked through the door. Connor owned a small marketing firm in town and had the kind of presence that commanded attention without demanding it. He was the type who could diffuse situations or inflame them, depending on his mood. "Brad! Jessica!" Connor called out, approaching with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to being welcome everywhere. "Running late again?" "Tyler here seems to think we should wait in line like everyone else," Brad said, his tone suggesting this was somehow unreasonable. Connor glanced at Tyler, then at the other customers in line, and Matt could see him making calculations. He could either support his friend's entitlement or demonstrate basic decency. Unfortunately, Connor chose loyalty over principles. "You know, Tyler," Connor said, his voice carrying the practiced persuasion of someone who sold ideas for a living, "accommodating regular customers is usually good business. We come in here pretty often." Now, Mac found himself watching something he'd seen too many times before. 3 against 1. Pressure building. Small compromises that led to larger ones. Tyler's smile never wavered, but Mac caught something in his eyes, a flash of disappointment that suggested this wasn't the first time his fairness had been challenged. "I appreciate that you're regular customers," Tyler replied, and Mac could hear the slight strain in his voice now. "But our policy is first come, first served. It keeps things fair for everyone." "Fair," Jessica repeated, finally looking up from her phone with exaggerated exasperation. "That's a cute concept, but this is the real world. Some people's time is worth more than others." The words hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire, and Mac felt something shift inside his chest. He'd heard variations of that sentiment before, usually from people who'd never had to learn the actual value of a human life. Usually from people who'd never held someone while they bled out in the sand, whispering about the little brother they'd never see again. Mrs. Helen Carter, still standing in line ahead of Brad, turned around again, with the kind of dignified indignation that only comes with age and experience. "Young lady, I raised 4 children and buried a husband who died serving this country. I think I can spare 5 minutes for a cup of coffee." "No offense," Brad said, though his tone suggested he intended plenty. "But that's exactly the kind of thinking that keeps businesses from being efficient. This isn't personal. It's just economics." Mac's hand tightened around his coffee cup. 20 years ago, he might have said something. 10 years ago, he definitely would have. But time and disappointment had taught him that most battles weren't worth fighting, that most people weren't worth the energy it took to educate them. He'd learned to pick his spots, to save his strength for fights that mattered. But as he watched Tyler's shoulders tense slightly, as he saw the young man's professional mask beginning to show cracks, Mac felt a familiar stirring. It was the same feeling he'd had in a dozen different situations, in places whose names he couldn't pronounce, when he'd seen good people being pressed by bad ones and had to decide whether to act or walk away. Tyler moved with practiced efficiency, finishing Mrs. Carter's order with the same careful attention he gave everyone. She accepted her coffee with a grateful smile and made a point of dropping a generous tip in the jar before walking past Brad without another glance. The message was clear. Dignity wasn't for sale. As Tyler turned to take Brad's order, his sleeve caught on the edge of the espresso machine, pulling back just enough to reveal more of the tattoo on his forearm. This time, Mac saw it clearly. The wolf's head was rendered in sharp detail, ears alert, eyes fierce. Below it, crossed rifles formed an X, and beneath that, in bold letters that seemed to jump off Tyler's skin, BRAVO7. Mac's coffee cup slipped from his fingers, hitting the floor with a crash that silenced the entire coffee shop. Hot liquid splashed across his jeans, but he didn't notice. He was somewhere else entirely, somewhere with sand and blood and the sound of helicopters that came too late. He was holding a young soldier whose dog tags read Derek Brooks, listening to him whisper about a little brother back home who was going to college, who was going to make something of himself, who Derek would never get to see graduate. The world came back into focus slowly. Tyler was already around the counter, kneeling beside Mac with a towel, genuine concern replacing his professional smile. "Sir, are you okay? Did you burn yourself?" Mac stared at Tyler's arm, at the tattoo that had haunted his dreams for 12 years. The wolf's head that Derek had described in those final moments, the symbol his unit had adopted because preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Moved like a pack, always together, never leaving anyone behind. Except they had left someone behind. They'd left Derek. "Your tattoo," Mac managed, his voice barely above a whisper. BRAVO7. Tyler paused in his cleaning, following Mac's gaze to his exposed forearm. For a moment, something passed over his face, a shadow that suggested the ink carried weight beyond decoration. "Yeah," Tyler said quietly, "my brother's unit. He served in Afghanistan." The coffee shop had gone quiet, customers straining to hear the conversation. Brad stood at the counter, his order forgotten, irritation at the delay clear on his face. Jessica held her phone up, apparently recording the scene for her social media. Connor watched with the calculating interest of someone who sensed drama unfolding. Mac looked into Tyler's eyes, searching for family resemblance he should have seen before. The shape of the nose was different, the color of the eyes, but there was something in the set of the jaw, the way Tyler held himself, that echoed the young soldier Mac had carried through the desert sand. "Derek Brooks," Mac said, and watched Tyler's world tilt on its axis. Tyler's hand froze on the towel. His face went pale, then flushed, then pale again. "You knew my brother?" The question carried so much hope, so much pain, that Mac felt his chest tighten. He'd imagined this moment 1,000 times, practiced the words he'd say if he ever found Derek's family. But sitting on the floor of a coffee shop with hot coffee soaking through his clothes, all those practiced speeches evaporated. "I was there," Mac said simply. "I was with him." Tyler sat back on his heels, the towel falling from his hands. Around them, the coffee shop held its breath. Even Brad had stopped complaining, sensing that something significant was happening, even if he didn't understand what. "You were with him when he died?" Tyler asked, his voice steady but his eyes bright with unshed tears. Mac nodded. "I carried him out. He talked about you. Said you were going to college. Said you were the smart one in the family. Said you were going to do something important." Tyler's hand moved unconsciously to his tattoo, tracing the outline of the wolf's head. "He got this tattoo right before his deployment. Sent me a picture of it. Said he was part of a pack now. Said they'd all look out for each other." "They did," Max said, struggling to his feet with Tyler's help. "They all looked out for each other. Your brother saved 3 men that day before." He couldn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. "Before the IED, Tyler completed, his voice barely audible. "I know what happened. I read the reports." "The reports?" Mac knew what those said. Sanitized language that reduced horror to bullet points, that transformed Derek Brooks from a young man with dreams and fears into a casualty statistic. The reports didn't mention the way Derek had smiled when he talked about his little brother, or how he'd made Mac promise to find Tyler if anything happened. They didn't capture the weight of a promise that had haunted Mac for 12 years. Brad cleared his throat loudly, his patience finally exhausted. "Look, this is very touching and all, but some of us actually have places to be. Can we maybe finish this reunion later?" The words cut through the moment like a blade, shattering the fragile bubble of connection that had formed around Mac and Tyler. Jessica looked up from her phone, where she'd apparently been live streaming the encounter, her expression suggesting she found the interruption reasonable. "Seriously," she added, "this is supposed to be a coffee shop, not a therapy session." Connor shifted uncomfortably, recognizing that his friends had just crossed a line that even his social skills couldn't smooth over. The other customers in the shop stared at Brad and Jessica with expressions ranging from disbelief to disgust. Mrs. Carter, who had paused at the door to listen, turned back with fire in her eyes. "That young man just learned something about his deceased brother," she said, her voice carrying the authority of age and loss. "If you can't find 5 minutes of human decency in your schedule, perhaps you should examine your priorities." "Ma'am, no disrespect," Brad replied, though his tone suggested otherwise. "But this is a business, not a support group. Time is money." Tyler stood slowly, and Mac saw something change in his posture. The easy customer service demeanor was gone, replaced by something harder, more direct. When he spoke, his voice carried an edge that suggested Brad had just made a significant miscalculation. "Time is money," Tyler repeated, as if testing the words. "You know what my brother's time was worth when he stepped on that IED, when he bled out in the sand trying to save his friends? What's the exchange rate on that?" The coffee shop went dead silent. Even the espresso machine seemed to hold its breath. Brad's face flushed red, but whether from embarrassment or anger, Mac couldn't tell. "Look, I'm sorry about your brother," Brad said, his tone suggesting he was anything but. "But that doesn't give you the right to lecture paying customers about—" "About what?" Tyler interrupted, stepping closer to the counter. "About respect? About basic human decency? About understanding that some things matter more than your meeting?" Jessica lowered her phone, perhaps finally recognizing that this wasn't the kind of content her followers were looking for. Connor took a step back, clearly wanting distance from whatever was about to happen. Mac watched the confrontation unfold with growing recognition. He'd seen this before, the moment when someone who'd never been tested decided to push someone who had. The moment when privilege met purpose and assumed it would win simply because it always had before. "I'm going to need you to calm down," Brad said, pulling out his phone. "Because if you can't provide professional service, maybe I need to speak to your manager." Tyler's laugh was short and bitter. "My manager, right. You want to complain that I'm not being professional enough while you interrupt a conversation about my dead brother. Your personal problems aren't my responsibility, Brad shot back. I came here for coffee, not a sob story. That was the moment Mac stood up. Not quickly, not aggressively, but with the deliberate movement of someone who'd made a decision. The conversation stopped as he walked toward the counter, his slight limp more pronounced than usual. Tyler looked at him with gratitude, Mrs. Carter with approval, and Brad with growing unease. "Son," Mac said quietly, looking directly at Brad, "you should probably stop talking now." There was something in Mac's voice, something that suggested Brad had wandered into territory he didn't understand. But Brad had spent his entire life having his problems solved by volume and entitlement, and he wasn't about to change tactics now. "Excuse me?" Brad said, puffing up like a threatened animal. "This has nothing to do with you, old man. Why don't you mind your own business?" Mac smiled, but it wasn't a warm expression. It was the kind of smile that came with the memory of young men who'd talked tough, right up until the moment they learned the difference between conflict and combat. "Tyler," Mac said without taking his eyes off Brad, "would you mind showing me that tattoo again?" Tyler pushed up his sleeve without hesitation, revealing the full design. The wolf's head seemed to stare directly at Brad, and the crossed rifles beneath it suddenly looked less like decoration and more like warning. "Bravo 7, Mac said, loud enough for everyone in the coffee shop to hear. 7th Infantry Battalion, 2nd Brigade. They called themselves the Wolf Pack. 11 men went out on patrol that day. Only one came home." He turned to face Tyler, his voice softening. "Your brother Derek was 22 years old. He played guitar, badly, and he had a picture of you in his helmet. He was going to teach you to drive stick shift when he got home, and he was worried you were spending too much time studying and not enough time dating." Tyler's eyes filled with tears, and he nodded. "He always said that, said I needed to get out more." Mac turned back to Brad, who had gone very quiet. Derek stepped on an improvised explosive device while pulling 2 wounded soldiers to safety. He saved 3 lives that day, and he died thinking about his little brother who was working his way through college. The silence in the coffee shop was absolute. Even the background music seemed to have stopped. Mac took a step closer to Brad, close enough that the younger man had to look up to meet his eyes. "So when you say this young man's personal problems aren't your responsibility," Mac continued, his voice still quiet but carrying the weight of absolute certainty, "you might want to consider that his personal problems include carrying the memory of a hero who died so people like you could stand in coffee shops and complain about wait times." Brad's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. Jessica had put her phone away entirely, and Connor looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. Mrs. Carter nodded approvingly from her spot by the door, and Tom, the firefighter who had just walked in, stopped to listen with the kind of attention that suggested he understood exactly what he was witnessing. "I didn't know," Brad finally managed, though the words sounded weak even to him. "No," Mac agreed. "You didn't, and you didn't bother to find out before you decided his grief was inconvenient for you." Tyler wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, leaving the wolf tattoo exposed. "Marcus," he said quietly, "you said you made a promise to my brother?" Mac nodded. "He asked me to find you, to tell you he was proud of you, and that he loved you, and that he was sorry he wouldn't be there to see you graduate." "He kept his promise," Tyler said, his voice breaking slightly. "He did see me graduate. I felt him there." The moment stretched between them, heavy with grief and connection, and the strange mercy of time. Around them, the coffee shop had become a sacred space, a place where 2 lives touched across the gap left by a third. Then Brad, perhaps feeling that the attention had shifted away from him for too long, or perhaps simply unable to read the room, decided to speak again. "This is all very moving," he said, his tone suggesting it was anything but. "But I still have a meeting to get to. Can we please just order our coffee and move on?" The words fell into the silence like stones into still water, creating ripples of disbelief that spread throughout the coffee shop. Tom, the firefighter, actually shook his head in amazement. Mrs. Carter made a sound of disgust. Even Connor looked at his friend like he'd never seen him before. But it was Tyler who responded, and when he did, his voice carried a new quality. Not anger, not hurt, but something much more dangerous. Clarity. "You know what?" Tyler said, reaching behind the counter and untying his apron. "I think I'm done taking orders for the day." He walked around the counter to stand next to Mac, his tattoo still visible, the wolf's head now seeming to watch Brad with predatory interest. "Marcus, would you like to get some real coffee? There's a place across town that actually cares about treating people with respect." Mac nodded, understanding passing between them like a current. "I'd like that very much." As they walked toward the door together, Tyler paused to address the room. "For anyone who's wondering, my manager Jake will be in around noon. I'm sure he'll be very interested to hear about this morning's conversation." They were almost to the door when Connor finally found his voice. "Tyler, wait, Brad didn't mean—" Tyler turned back, and for the first time all morning his smile was genuine. "You know what, Connor? I think he meant exactly what he said. And I think you all learned something important today." "What's that?" Connor asked, though he sounded like he already knew the answer wouldn't be comfortable. Tyler's hand moved to his tattoo one more time, tracing the outline of the wolf's head with obvious affection. "You learned that some people earn their ink, and some people just talk." As the door closed behind them, Mac and Tyler walked out into the October morning air, leaving behind them a coffee shop full of people who were just beginning to understand what they'd witnessed. Behind the counter, Emma Sullivan, Tyler's young coworker, stared at the three men still standing at the counter with an expression that suggested she was reconsidering everything she thought she knew about customer service. "So," she said finally, her voice carrying a sweetness that didn't quite hide the steel beneath it, "did you gentlemen still want to place an order? Because I should probably mention that we have a new policy about treating our staff with basic human decency. It's going to be strictly enforced from now on." Brad, Jessica, and Connor looked at each other, then at the room full of customers who were all watching them, with expressions ranging from curiosity to outright hostility. Without another word, they turned and walked out, leaving behind them the kind of silence that comes after truth has been spoken and lies have been exposed. Outside, Mac and Tyler stood on the sidewalk, breathing in the crisp morning air. The crisis had passed, but both men seemed to understand that something significant had just begun. The walk to Mac's truck felt like traveling through two different worlds. Behind them, the warm glow of Riverside Coffee Company spilled onto the sidewalk, but ahead stretched the quiet streets of Millbrook, where the morning rush was just beginning to stir. Mac moved with the careful deliberation of someone whose body carried invisible weight, while Tyler walked beside him in stunned silence, his mind clearly racing to process what had just happened. Mac's pickup truck sat parked under the shade of an old oak tree, its blue paint faded, and its bumper bearing the kind of dents that spoke of years spent hauling more than just groceries. He unlocked the passenger door for Tyler, a gesture that seemed both natural and careful, as if he was still processing the fact that Derek Brooks' little brother was real, was here, was 24 years old, instead of the teenager Mac had imagined all these years. "You don't have to do this," Tyler said as he climbed into the truck. "I mean, I know this is probably weird for you. Running into family of someone you—" He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Max settled into the driver's seat, his hands resting on the steering wheel without starting the engine. "I've been looking for you for 12 years, he said quietly. "Well, not actively looking, but hoping, wondering. Derek talked about you so much that I felt like I knew you before I ever saw your face." Tyler stared out the windshield at the quiet street. A jogger passed by, earbuds in, completely absorbed in her own world. A man in a business suit walked his dog, checking his phone while the golden retriever sniffed at every fire hydrant. Normal people living normal lives, completely unaware that two strangers were sitting in a truck sharing the weight of a ghost. "What was he like?" Tyler asked finally. "I mean, I know what he was like as my brother, but what was he like as a soldier, as your friend?" Mac started the engine but didn't put the truck in gear. He seemed to be buying time, searching for words that could capture someone who was gone. Derek was the kind of guy who made everyone around him better. Not in a preachy way, not like he was trying to fix people. He just had this way of seeing the best in situations, even when everything was falling apart. He pulled away from the curb, driving slowly through the residential streets of Millbrook. The town was the kind of place where people still waved at passing cars, where front porches held rocking chairs and American flags, where the pace of life moved just slow enough for neighbors to actually know each other's names. He was also stubborn as hell, Mac continued, and Tyler laughed despite himself. "Sound familiar?" "Yeah, that's Derek. Mom used to say he got that from Dad's side of the family. Said all the Brooks men were too proud for their own good." They drove in comfortable silence for a while, past the elementary school where crossing guards were setting up for the morning rush, past the fire station where Tom Wilson was probably catching a few hours of sleep after his shift, past the small houses with their neat lawns and flower gardens that spoke of lives lived with intention and care. "Where are we going?" Tyler asked, though he didn't sound worried. There was something about Mac's presence that inspired trust, a quality that probably explained why Derek had felt comfortable enough to share his deepest thoughts with this man in his final moments. "There's a diner about 10 minutes from here," Mac said. "Quiet place. Good coffee. I thought maybe we could sit somewhere private and I could tell you about your brother. Really tell you. Not just the sanitized version they put in the reports." Tyler nodded, his fingers unconsciously tracing the outline of his tattoo through his shirt. "I'd like that. I've read everything I could get my hands on about what happened over there, but it never felt complete. Like there were pieces missing." "There were," Mac confirmed. "A lot of pieces. Some of them were classified, some were just too painful to put in official reports. But Derek made me promise to find you, and part of that promise was telling you the truth about who he was and what he did." The diner Mac had chosen was exactly what Tyler had expected from his description. Mel's Place sat on a quiet corner, its neon sign flickering slightly in the morning light. The parking lot held a mix of pickup trucks, older sedans, and a few motorcycles, suggesting the kind of clientele that valued substance over style. Through the windows, Tyler could see red vinyl booths and a counter lined with stools, the kind of place where coffee came in heavy ceramic mugs, and the waitresses called everyone "Hon." Inside, the diner buzzed with the low conversation of people who had known each other for years. A group of retirees occupied the large corner booth, their discussion of local politics animated but friendly. 2 truckers sat at the counter, comparing routes and sharing road stories. A young mother tried to convince her toddler that pancakes were better than candy for breakfast, a battle she was clearly losing. Mac chose a booth in the back corner, away from the main flow of traffic but with a clear view of the door. Tyler noticed the choice, and recognized it for what it was, the kind of tactical positioning that became second nature to people who'd learned to always have an exit strategy. Their waitress was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and hands that moved with the efficiency of decades spent balancing plates and pouring coffee. She approached their table with the sort of genuine warmth that couldn't be faked or trained. "Morning, Marcus," she said, and Tyler was surprised to hear Mac's name. "Haven't seen you in a while. The usual?" "Please, Dorothy, and can you bring my friend here a menu? He's new to town." Dorothy smiled at Tyler with the kind of automatic acceptance that small towns sometimes offered to strangers. "Coffee while you're deciding, hon?" "Please," Tyler said, grateful for the normalcy of the interaction. After the intensity of the morning, there was something soothing about being in a place where the biggest decision was whether to order eggs over easy or scrambled. When Dorothy had filled their cups and moved on to other customers, Mac leaned back in his seat and studied Tyler with the kind of attention that suggested he was still trying to reconcile the young man in front of him with the teenager Derek had described. "You look like him," Mac said finally. "Not exactly, but there's something around the eyes, and the way you carry yourself." Derek had that same straightness to his posture, like he was always ready for whatever came next. Tyler wrapped his hands around his coffee mug, using the warmth to ground himself. People always said we looked alike when we were kids, but I never saw it. Derek was always bigger, stronger, more confident. I was the skinny kid who spent too much time reading. He was proud of that, Mac said. The reading, I mean. He used to brag about how smart his little brother was, how you were going to college and going to do something important with your life. He said you were the one who was going to make a difference in the world. I'm a barista, Tyler said with a self-deprecating laugh. I make coffee drinks and deal with entitled customers. Not exactly changing the world. Mac's expression grew serious. You stood up to those people this morning. You didn't let them walk over you, and you didn't let them disrespect your brother's memory. That takes courage. Derek would have been proud. Tyler felt his throat tighten. I just got tired of being treated like I didn't matter, like my feelings didn't count because I'm just some kid making minimum wage. You're not just anything, Mac said firmly. You're Derek Brooks' brother. You're the person he thought about when he was scared, the person he talked about when he needed something good to focus on. You're the reason he fought so hard to stay alive long enough to get his men to safety. The words hung between them, heavy with meaning and loss. Tyler had grown up knowing his brother was a hero, but hearing it from someone who had been there, who had seen it firsthand, made it real in a way that official letters and folded flags never could. Tell me about that day, Tyler said quietly. Not the official version, the real version. Mac was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee as if it might hold answers to questions he'd been asking himself for 12 years. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful, measured, as if he was walking through a minefield of memory. It was supposed to be a routine patrol, he began. Intelligence suggested there was a weapons cache in a village about 20 clicks from our forward operating base. Simple mission, in theory. Go in, check it out, secure anything we found, get out. Your brother was part of the team because he was good with languages. He'd been studying Arabic in his spare time, said he wanted to be able to talk to the locals, build relationships. Tyler smiled, despite the gravity of the conversation. That's so Derek. He was always trying to connect with people, even when we were kids. He'd be the one who made friends with the new kid at school, who invited the shy kids to sit with us at lunch. That's exactly what he was like over there, Mac confirmed. While some guys treated the deployment like they were in enemy territory, Derek treated it like he was visiting neighbors. He learned people's names, asked about their families, brought candy for the kids. The locals loved him. Dorothy appeared at their table, refilling their cups without being asked. Mac waited until she was out of earshot before continuing. The mission started normally. We rolled out at dawn, 3 vehicles, 11 men total. The village was quiet when we arrived, too quiet. That should have been our first warning, but intelligence had been good lately, and we'd gotten comfortable. Complacent. Tyler could see the weight of regret in Mac's expression, the guilt of a survivor who'd replayed every decision 1,000 times. Derek was in the lead vehicle with me and 4 other guys. The plan was to secure the perimeter while the other teams searched the buildings. But as soon as we started moving through the village, everything went wrong. Mac paused, his hands tightening around his coffee mug. The first IED went off under the rear vehicle, flipped it completely over, killed the driver instantly, wounded 3 others. The second explosion came from inside one of the buildings, took out most of the second team. And then the small arms fire started. Tyler felt his chest tighten as he imagined the chaos, the confusion, the sudden transformation from routine mission to life-or-death situation. How many men were hurt? 7 down in the first 30 seconds, Mac said, his voice flat with the kind of emotional distance that came from having to recount tragedy multiple times. 3 dead, 4 wounded seriously enough that they couldn't move on their own, and we were taking fire from at least 3 different positions. What did Derek do? Mac's expression softened slightly, and for the first time since he'd started the story, Tyler saw something that looked like pride. He did what Derek always did. He saw people who needed help, and he helped them. While the rest of us were trying to figure out what was happening, where the fire was coming from, how to get out of there alive, Derek was already moving. Moving where? Toward the wounded. The overturned vehicle had 2 guys trapped inside, and the building explosion had left 3 more in the open with no cover. Derek grabbed the medic kit and started crawling toward them, even though it meant exposing himself to enemy fire. Tyler could picture it clearly, his brother's face set with determination, focused not on his own safety, but on the people who needed him. It was the same expression Derek had worn when he'd taught Tyler to ride a bike, when he'd scared off the neighborhood bullies, when he'd stayed up all night helping Tyler with algebra homework. I tried to stop him, Mac continued. Told him it was too dangerous, that we needed to call for backup, wait for air support. But Derek just looked at me and said, "They're dying now, Mac. They don't have time for backup." So he went anyway. And somehow, impossibly, he made it to the first wounded soldier without getting hit. Started treating him right there in the open, with bullets flying over his head. Got the bleeding stopped, got him stable enough to move. Then he went back for the second one. Tyler felt tears beginning to form, but he didn't try to stop them. He saved them. All 3 of the guys who were trapped in the open. Dragged them one by one to a position where we could provide covering fire. Got them medical attention. Made sure they were going to make it home to their families. Mac's voice grew quieter, more strained. But the 2 guys in the overturned vehicle were still trapped. And Derek wasn't done. Tyler already knew how the story ended, but hearing it from Mac, from someone who had been there, made it feel immediate and real in a way that official reports never could. The vehicle was upside down, fuel leaking everywhere, and we could hear the guys inside calling for help. The smart thing would have been to wait for heavy equipment, for backup, for someone with the right tools. But Derek heard them calling, and he couldn't wait. What did he do? He crawled under that vehicle, in the middle of a firefight, with fuel soaking into his uniform and enemy rounds hitting the ground around him. He got the first guy out, a kid named Martinez, who'd been pinned under the dashboard. Carried him back to safety, then went back for the second guy. Mac paused, staring out the window at the peaceful street beyond. A school bus was making its rounds, stopping to pick up children who waved at their parents from the sidewalk. Normal life, continuing its rhythm while he recounted the day that had changed everything. That's when the 3rd IED went off, Mac said finally. Derek was pulling the second guy out from under the vehicle when it detonated. Close enough to flip the already damaged vehicle completely over. Close enough to... He trailed off, unable to finish. Tyler reached across the table and placed his hand over Mac's. "It's okay. You don't have to say it." Mac looked up, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "He saved 6 men that day, Tyler. 6 guys who went home to their families because your brother decided their lives were worth more than his own safety. And even after the explosion, even with his own injuries, he kept talking, kept trying to help, kept asking about the other guys, making sure they were going to be okay." What did he say? At the end? Mac was quiet for a long moment. "He asked me to make sure his men got home. Asked me to write to their families, to tell them their sons and husbands were heroes. And then he asked me to find you." Tyler felt the tears flowing freely now, but he didn't care. "What did he want you to tell me?" "He wanted you to know that he loved you, that he was proud of you, that he was sorry he wouldn't be there to see you graduate college. He wanted you to know that everything he did over there, he did thinking about you, thinking about the life you were going to build, the person you were going to become." "He was there," Tyler whispered. "At my graduation, I felt him there." Mac nodded, understanding exactly what Tyler meant. "He also wanted you to know that the money he'd been saving, the money he'd put aside for your education, it was yours. He'd arranged for it to be transferred to you if anything happened to him." Tyler looked up in surprise. "I never got any money. The Army said there were no additional benefits, no savings account, Nothing beyond the standard death benefits. Mac's expression darkened. That's because, officially, Derek Brooks never existed. None of us did. The mission was classified, the unit was disbanded, the records were sealed. As far as the Army was concerned, we were never there. What do you mean, never there? I mean that 3 days after Derek died, men in suits showed up at our forward operating base and told us that our entire deployment had been reclassified. National security, they said. The mission we'd been on was too sensitive to acknowledge, the location too politically volatile. They offered us new assignments, clean records, and a promise that our families would be taken care of if we signed non-disclosure agreements. Tyler felt a chill run down his spine. And you signed. We signed. We were young, we were scared, we were grieving. They told us it was the only way to protect our families, the only way to make sure what happened to Derek and the others wouldn't happen to anyone else. They said it was temporary, that once the political situation stabilized, our service would be properly recognized. But it never was. It never was. The unit was officially disbanded, our records were transferred to black sites, and we were reassigned to different bases with strict orders, never to contact each other, never to discuss what had happened. For 12 years I've been carrying the weight of that promise I made to Derek, knowing that I couldn't keep it because I didn't know how to find you. Tyler stared at Mac in disbelief. So my brother died a hero, saved 6 men's lives, and the government just pretended it never happened. Politics, Mac said bitterly. The village where Derek died was in a region that wasn't supposed to have American troops. Our presence there would have been embarrassing to certain politicians, would have complicated certain diplomatic relationships. So they decided it was easier to erase us than to explain us. And the money Derek saved for me? Probably sitting in an account that officially doesn't exist, administered by an agency that officially wasn't there. I've tried to track it down over the years, but without Derek's service records, without official acknowledgement of his deployment, there's no paper trail to follow. Tyler felt a surge of anger that surprised him with its intensity. So they took everything. His recognition, his benefits, his sacrifice. They just erased him like he never mattered. They tried to, Mac said. But they couldn't erase the men he saved. They couldn't erase the families who got their sons and husbands back, because Derek Brooks decided to be a hero. And they couldn't erase the promise he made me make. What promise? Mac reached into his jacket and pulled out a worn envelope, yellowed with age, and handled so many times that the edges were soft. Derek asked me to write down everything that happened that day, everything he said, everything he did. He wanted me to make sure that if anything happened to him, you'd know the truth. Not the sanitized version they'd put in the reports, but the real truth. Tyler took the envelope with shaking hands. His name was written on the front in careful handwriting, and underneath it, in Derek's familiar scrawl, were the words, "For my little brother, who's going to change the world." I've carried that letter for 12 years, Mac said. Rewritten it a dozen times, trying to find the right words, the right way to explain what your brother meant to all of us. But I never could find you. Until today. Tyler opened the envelope carefully, as if it might contain something fragile. Inside were several sheets of paper, covered in Mac's careful handwriting. The first page began simply, "Tyler, my name is Marcus Thompson, and I was with your brother when he died. He asked me to tell you his story." "I don't expect you to read it now," Mac said, "but when you're ready, when you want to know everything about that day, it's all there. The good parts and the bad parts, the heroic parts and the human parts. Everything that made Derek the man he was." Tyler carefully folded the letter and put it in his jacket pocket, next to his heart. "Thank you. For keeping your promise, for finding me, for making sure Derek's story didn't die with him." "There's more," Mac said quietly. "The letter is just the beginning. Derek wasn't the only one who died that day, and he wasn't the only one whose sacrifice was erased. There were 2 other men, good men, who died trying to save their friends. Their families never got the whole truth either. Have you found them? The other families? I've found some of them. It's taken years, but I've tracked down most of the survivors. Most of the families. We've been meeting quietly, sharing stories, trying to keep the memory of what really happened alive. We call ourselves the Forgotten Company. Tyler looked up in surprise. There are others? There are others, and they're going to want to meet you, Tyler. They're going to want to hear about Derek from someone who knew him before he was a soldier, who loved him as a brother, not just as a comrade. The weight of it hit Tyler all at once. He wasn't just Derek's brother anymore. He was the keeper of a legacy, the living connection to a group of men whose heroism had been officially erased, but whose sacrifice deserved to be remembered. When? Tyler asked. When can I meet them? Mac smiled for the first time since they'd sat down. Soon. There's actually a gathering next month, just outside of town. Nothing official, nothing public. Just the families and the survivors, coming together to remember the men who didn't make it home. I'll be there, Tyler said without hesitation. I want to hear all of their stories. I want to know about the men who served with Derek, who died with him, who saved lives that day. Mac reached across the table and shook Tyler's hand, the gesture formal but genuine. Derek would be proud of you, Tyler. He'd be proud of the man you've become, proud of the way you stood up for yourself this morning, proud of the way you're honoring his memory. Tyler felt a warmth spread through his chest, the kind of feeling he hadn't experienced since Derek had left for deployment. For the first time in 12 years, he felt connected to his brother again, felt like the promise Derek had made to always watch over him was real and present. What do I do now? Tyler asked. How do I live with all of this? Mac was quiet for a moment, considering the question. You live the life Derek died to protect. You use the education he wanted you to have. You build the future he believed in. You become the man he knew you could be. And you remember that you're not carrying this alone anymore. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, two men bound together by loss and love and the unbreakable promise of a soldier who had died too young. Outside, the morning was giving way to afternoon, and the diner was beginning to fill with the lunch crowd. But in their corner booth, time seemed suspended, held in place by the weight of truth finally spoken and promises finally kept. Tyler thought about the tattoo on his arm, the wolf's head, that had seemed like just a symbol of remembrance when he'd gotten it. Now he understood that it was more than that. It was a declaration, a statement of belonging, a way of saying that some bonds couldn't be broken by death or distance, or the deliberate erasure of inconvenient truths. Mac, Tyler said finally, that morning when Derek died, when he asked you to find me, did he say anything else? Anything about what he wanted me to do? Mac nodded slowly. He said he wanted you to know that being a hero wasn't about being perfect, or fearless, or never making mistakes. He said being a hero was about deciding that other people's lives mattered more than your own comfort, that other people's pain was worth your own sacrifice. And he thought, I could be that kind of person? He knew you could be that kind of person. He said you'd been showing him what heroism looked like since you were kids. Every time you stood up for someone who was being picked on, every time you helped someone who was struggling, every time you chose kindness over convenience. Tyler felt tears threatening again, but this time they were tears of gratitude rather than grief. I don't know if I'm ready to be the person he thought I was. Nobody ever is, Max said, but that's what makes it heroism. You do it anyway, not because you're ready, but because it needs to be done. As they prepared to leave the diner, Tyler realized that the morning had changed him in ways he was only beginning to understand. When he'd woken up that morning, he'd been just another college student working a part-time job, trying to get by. Now he was the keeper of a legacy, the living representative of a group of heroes whose sacrifice had been officially erased, but whose memory would live on through the people who loved them. The ride back to town was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet than the ride out had been. This silence was comfortable, companionable, the kind that came from shared understanding rather than awkward uncertainty. Tyler found himself looking at the familiar streets of Millbrook with new eyes, seeing them not just as the place where he lived and worked, but as the place where Derek's legacy would continue to live through him. When they pulled up outside Riverside Coffee Company, Tyler was surprised to see a small crowd gathered on the sidewalk. Some of the faces he recognized from the morning's confrontation, but others were new. Mrs. Carter stood near the front of the group, her expression determined. Tom, the firefighter, was there too, along with several other people Tyler had seen in the shop but never really talked to. "What's going on?" Tyler asked as he got out of the truck. Emma, his co-worker, broke away from the group and hurried over to them. "Tyler, thank God you're back. Jake's been looking for you. Those guys from this morning, they came back with some corporate lawyer demanding you be fired. They're claiming you created a hostile work environment." Tyler felt his heart sink. After everything that had happened, after the connection he'd found with Mac, and the promise he'd made to honor Derek's memory, was he going to lose his job because he'd stood up for himself? "But here's the thing," Emma continued, her voice gaining strength. "After you left, people started talking. Mrs. Carter told everyone what she'd witnessed. Tom shared what he'd seen, and word spread. People are angry, Tyler. They're angry that those men treated you that way, angry that they showed such disrespect for your brother's memory." Tyler looked around at the faces of the people gathered on the sidewalk. These were his customers, people he'd served coffee to dozens of times, people he'd smiled at and chatted with, and treated with the kind of genuine warmth that had become his trademark. Now they were here, standing up for him, supporting him in a way that felt both surprising and deeply moving. "What did Jake say?" Tyler asked. Emma grinned. "Jake told the lawyer that if those men wanted to file a complaint, they were welcome to do so. He also told them that based on witness statements from multiple customers, their behavior this morning was unacceptable, and they were no longer welcome in the shop." Tyler felt a surge of gratitude that surprised him with its intensity. "He stood up for me?" "He stood up for you," Emma confirmed. "But more than that, he wants to talk to you about what happened. He wants to hear your side of the story, wants to understand what those men said that upset you so much." Tyler looked at Mac, who nodded encouragingly. "Go ahead," Mac said. "Tell him the truth. Tell him about Derek, about what that tattoo means, about why their words hurt so much. People need to know that heroes come in all forms, and that disrespect for one is disrespect for all." Tyler took a deep breath, squared his shoulders, and walked toward the coffee shop. As he did, the crowd on the sidewalk parted, creating a path for him. Mrs. Carter reached out and squeezed his arm as he passed. Tom nodded approvingly, and several other people offered words of encouragement. Inside the shop, Jake was waiting behind the counter, his expression serious but not unkind. Jake Rodriguez was a good manager, the kind who treated his employees fairly and expected his customers to do the same. He'd hired Tyler not just because he needed the job, but because he'd recognized something in the young man that suggested he'd be good with people, good at creating the kind of atmosphere that made customers want to come back. "Tyler," Jake said as he approached the counter, "I need to hear what happened this morning. The whole story, from the beginning." Tyler glanced back at Mac, who had followed him into the shop and was now standing near the door with his arms crossed and his expression watchful. The presence of the older man gave Tyler strength, reminded him that he wasn't alone in this, that he had allies who understood the weight of what he was carrying. "It started with my tattoo," Tyler began, and then he told Jake everything. He told him about Derek, about the unit that had never come home, about the promise Mac had made and the letter he'd carried for 12 years. He told him about the way Brad and Jessica and Connor had treated him, about their dismissive attitude toward his grief, about their assumption that his pain was less important than their convenience. Jake listened without interruption, his expression growing more serious with each detail. When Tyler finished, there was a long moment of silence in the coffee shop. Even the customers who had been pretending not to listen had gone quiet, waiting to hear what Jake would say. "Tyler," Jake said finally, "I want you to know that what happened to you this morning was completely unacceptable. No employee should have to deal with that kind of treatment, and no customer should be allowed to behave that way in my shop." Tyler felt a wave of relief wash over him. So I'm not fired? Jake looked surprised. Fired? Tyler, you're getting a raise, and I want to put up a display in the shop. Something that honors your brother and the other men who served with him. If you're comfortable with that. Tyler felt tears threatening again, but this time they were tears of gratitude and relief. I'd like that very much. Good, Jake said. Because I've also been thinking about what Mrs. Carter told me, about how you handled yourself this morning, the way you stood up for yourself, the way you maintained your dignity even when those people were being cruel. That takes character, Tyler. That takes strength. I learned it from Derek, Tyler said simply. He always said that how you treat people when they can't fight back says everything about who you really are. Jake nodded approvingly. Your brother sounds like he was a wise man. And a brave one. He was both, Tyler confirmed. And I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of his example. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of the front door opening. Tyler looked up to see Colonel Sarah Martinez walking in, her bearing unmistakably military despite the civilian clothes she wore. She was a woman in her 50s with steel-gray hair and eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. Behind her walked a younger man in uniform, a captain whose nameplate read Morrison. Mac straightened when he saw her, his entire posture changing in a way that suggested deep respect and old familiarity. Colonel Martinez, he said, his voice formal but warm. Marcus Thompson, she replied, approaching with a slight smile. I heard through the grapevine that you'd found someone we'd been looking for. Tyler looked between Mac and the colonel, confusion evident on his face. I don't understand. Colonel Martinez extended her hand to Tyler. You must be Tyler Brooks. I'm Sarah Martinez, and I had the honor of serving with your brother Derek. I was his commanding officer during his final deployment. Tyler shook her hand, still trying to process what was happening. You knew Derek? I knew Derek, she confirmed. And I've been looking for you for almost as long as Marcus has. We have some things to discuss, Tyler. Some things that should have been discussed 12 years ago. The coffee shop had gone completely quiet now. Every customer and employee focused on the conversation taking place at the counter. Tyler could feel the weight of their attention, but it didn't feel oppressive. It felt supportive, like a community coming together to witness something important. What kind of things? Tyler asked. Colonel Martinez glanced around the coffee shop, taking in the crowd of listeners. Perhaps we should discuss this somewhere more private. There are some matters of military protocol that need to be addressed, some oversights that need to be corrected. Tyler looked at Mac, who nodded encouragingly. It's okay, Tyler. This is what Derek would have wanted. This is what we've been working toward for 12 years. Working toward what? Colonel Martinez's expression grew serious. Recognition, Tyler. Official recognition of your brother's service, his sacrifice, and his heroism. It's long overdue, but it's finally possible. Tyler felt his heart racing. What do you mean? I mean that certain political situations have changed, certain classifications have been lifted, and certain injustices can finally be corrected. Your brother's unit is going to be officially recognized, Tyler. Their service is going to be acknowledged. Their sacrifice is going to be honored, and their families are going to receive the benefits they should have received 12 years ago. Tyler stared at her in disbelief. After all this time? After all this time, she confirmed. But first we need to talk. We need to discuss what this means, what it involves, and what your role in all of this might be. Tyler looked around the coffee shop at the faces of the people who had supported him, who had stood up for him, who had shown him that he wasn't alone in this fight. He thought about Derek, about the promise Mac had made, about the letter he now carried in his jacket pocket. Whatever it is, Tyler said, I'm ready. I've been ready for 12 years. Colonel Martinez smiled, and for the first time, Tyler saw warmth in her eyes. "I think your brother would be very proud of you, Tyler." "Very proud indeed." As they prepared to leave the coffee shop, Tyler realized that the morning had been more than just a chance encounter. It had been a convergence, a moment when all the scattered pieces of a 12-year-old promise had finally come together. Derek's sacrifice was going to be recognized, his heroism was going to be acknowledged, and his memory was going to live on in ways that went far beyond the tattoo on his little brother's arm. The crowd on the sidewalk had grown larger, word spreading through the small town about what was happening at Riverside Coffee Co. People stood quietly, respectfully, as Tyler walked out with Mac and Colonel Martinez. They understood that they were witnessing something significant, something that went beyond local drama to touch on larger themes of honor, sacrifice, and the debt that the living owed to the dead. As they walked toward Colonel Martinez's vehicle, Tyler felt the weight of Derek's legacy settling on his shoulders. It was a heavy weight, but it was also a gift. His brother's sacrifice had meaning, his heroism had purpose, and his love for his little brother had created a chain of connection that stretched across time and space and loss. Tyler touched the tattoo on his arm, feeling the wolf's head beneath his fingers. For 12 years, it had been a symbol of mourning, a way of carrying Derek's memory. Now it was becoming something more. It was becoming a symbol of hope, of recognition, of the unbreakable bonds that connected the living to the dead and the present to the past. The drive to Colonel Martinez's office took them through the older part of Millbrook, where Victorian houses sat beneath ancient maple trees, and the sidewalks were cracked from decades of shifting seasons. Tyler sat in the passenger seat of the Colonel's sedan, watching the familiar neighborhoods pass by, while trying to process the magnitude of what was happening. Behind them, Mac followed in his pickup truck, and somehow his presence made everything feel more real, more grounded in the truth Tyler had been seeking for so long. Colonel Martinez drove with the same precision she brought to everything else, her hands steady on the wheel, her attention divided between the road ahead and the young man beside her. She'd been preparing for this conversation for months, ever since the Pentagon had finally declassified certain operations and allowed her to begin the process of setting the record straight. But sitting next to Derek Brooks's little brother, seeing the mix of hope and apprehension in his eyes, she felt the weight of 12 years of secrets and silences. "Tyler," she said as they stopped at a red light, "I want you to understand that what we're about to discuss isn't just about paperwork or military protocols. It's about justice. It's about making sure that the men who died that day, including your brother, finally receive the recognition they earned." Tyler nodded, his fingers unconsciously tracing the outline of his tattoo through his shirt. "Mac told me that the mission was classified, that your unit was officially disbanded. How is it possible to recognize something that never officially happened?" Colonel Martinez smiled grimly. "Politics change, Tyler. The people who made the decision to bury your brother's service are no longer in power. The diplomatic relationships that made his sacrifice inconvenient have shifted. What was once a liability has become an opportunity to demonstrate that America honors its heroes, even when that honor is long overdue." The light turned green, and they continued through the business district, past the courthouse where Tyler had gone to try to access Derek's military records, past the library where he'd spent countless hours researching his brother's deployment, trying to piece together fragments of information that had been deliberately obscured. Now, finally, he was going to get answers. Colonel Martinez's office was located in a small, nondescript building that housed several veteran services organizations. The space was functional rather than elegant, with metal desks, filing cabinets, and walls covered with commendation certificates and photographs of military units. But what struck Tyler immediately was the wall dedicated to fallen soldiers. Dozens of photographs arranged in neat rows, each representing a life cut short in service to their country. "That's where Derek belongs," Colonel Martinez said, following Tyler's gaze. "That's where he's going to be, along with the other men from his unit who didn't make it home." She led Tyler and Mac to a conference room where Captain Morrison was already waiting, a stack of folders spread across the table. The young officer stood when they entered, his posture respectful, but his expression suggesting he understood the gravity of what they were about to discuss. "Tyler Brooks," Colonel Martinez said formally, "I'd like you to meet Captain James Morrison. He's been working with the Pentagon's Records Review Board to reconstruct the official history of your brother's final mission." Captain Morrison stepped forward and shook Tyler's hand. "Mr. Brooks, it's an honor to meet you. Your brother's actions that day saved the lives of 6 soldiers, including 3 who are now serving as senior non-commissioned officers. Their children will grow up with fathers because of Derek's courage." Tyler felt his throat tighten. "I'd like to meet them someday. The men Derek saved." "You will," Captain Morrison assured him. "In fact, they've specifically requested to be present when your brother receives his posthumous commendation. They want to thank you personally for the sacrifice your family made." Colonel Martinez gestured for everyone to sit, then opened the first folder on the table. "Tyler, what I'm about to show you is the official after-action report from the mission where Derek died. Until 3 weeks ago, this document was classified at the highest levels. You're the first family member who's been allowed to see it." Tyler's hands shook slightly as he accepted the folder. The cover sheet bore official seals and classification markings, but beneath those bureaucratic symbols was the story he'd been trying to understand for 12 years. The story of how his brother had died, why his sacrifice had been erased, and what had really happened in that village on the other side of the world. The report was written in the clinical language of military documentation, but even the sanitized prose couldn't hide the heroism it described. Tyler read about the ambush, about the casualties, about Derek's repeated trips into enemy fire to rescue wounded soldiers. He read about the improvised explosive device that had finally claimed his brother's life, and about the 6 men who had survived because Derek Brooks had decided their lives were worth more than his own safety. The mission was part of a larger intelligence operation, Colonel Martinez explained as Tyler read. Your brother's unit was tasked with investigating reports of weapons trafficking in a region that was officially under the control of Allied forces. What they found was evidence of corruption that went very high up in the local government, corruption that certain people in Washington didn't want exposed. Tyler looked up from the report. "So they buried the whole thing?" "They buried the whole thing," Captain Morrison confirmed. "The unit was disbanded. The soldiers were reassigned with orders never to discuss their deployment, and the families were told that their sons and husbands had died in training accidents or routine patrols. The truth was deemed too politically sensitive to acknowledge." Mac leaned forward in his chair. "What's changed? Why is it possible to tell the truth now?" Colonel Martinez exchanged a glance with Captain Morrison. "The government officials who were being protected by the cover-up are no longer in office. The intelligence operation that Derek's mission was part of has been declassified as part of a broader transparency initiative, and there's been growing pressure from Congress to address the injustices done to families of soldiers whose service was improperly classified." Quote, Tyler felt a surge of anger that surprised him with its intensity. "So for 12 years, my family lived with incomplete information about Derek's death because some politicians didn't want to be embarrassed?" "Yes," Colonel Martinez said simply. "And I want you to know that I fought against that decision at the time. I argued that the families deserved the truth, that the soldiers deserved recognition, that secrecy was being used to protect the wrong people. But I was overruled." "What happened to your career after you spoke up?" Colonel Martinez's smile was rueful. "I was transferred to a desk job and effectively sidelined for several years. But that's the price you pay for doing what's right, and I'd make the same choice again." Tyler studied the older woman with new respect. "You sacrificed your career to try to get justice for Derek and the others?" "I tried to do my job," she said simply, "which was to take care of my soldiers and their families. I failed at that for 12 years, but I'm not going to fail anymore." Captain Morrison opened another folder and slid it across the table to Tyler. "This is the recommendation for your brother's Medal of Honor. It's been approved at every level up to the Secretary of Defense. The ceremony is scheduled for next month." Tyler stared at the document in disbelief. The Medal of Honor was the highest military decoration in the United States. reserved for acts of valor that went above and beyond the call of duty. He'd known Derek was a hero, but seeing it officially recognized, seeing his brother's name on the same document that had honored legends like Audie Murphy and Alvin York, was overwhelming. "There's more," Colonel Martinez said gently. "The back pay and benefits that were denied to your family are being restored, with interest. The college fund that Derek set up for you, the one that disappeared when his records were classified, has been located and will be released to you. And there's going to be a formal apology from the Department of Defense for the way your family was treated." Tyler felt tears beginning to form, but they were tears of relief and gratitude, rather than grief. After all this time, Derek's finally going to get the recognition he deserved? After all this time, Colonel Martinez confirmed. "But Tyler, there's something else we need to discuss. Something that goes beyond just restoring your brother's record." She opened a final folder, this one thicker than the others. "The Pentagon has authorized the formation of a new unit, a Special Operations Advisory Group, that will be tasked with investigating cases where soldiers' service has been improperly classified or their families have been denied appropriate recognition. We're calling it the Brooks Commission, in honor of your brother." Tyler looked up in surprise. "You're naming it after Derek?" "We're naming it after Derek," Captain Morrison confirmed, "and we'd like you to consider serving on it, not as a soldier, but as a civilian advocate. Someone who understands what it's like to have a family member's service erased. Someone who can speak for the families who are still fighting for answers." Tyler was quiet for a long moment, trying to process the enormity of what he was being offered. What would that involve? It would involve traveling to meet with families who are in the same situation you've been in, Colonel Martinez explained. Helping them navigate the bureaucracy, advocating for their rights, making sure they get the information and benefits they're entitled to. It would mean using your experience, your pain, to help others who are going through the same thing. Tyler thought about the letter Mac had carried for 12 years, about the promise Derek had made him make, about the morning's confrontation in the coffee shop. "Derek always said I was going to do something important with my life. Maybe this is what he meant." Mac smiled from across the table. "I think you're right, Tyler. I think this is exactly what he meant." Tyler looked around the conference room, at the faces of the people who had worked so hard to bring him the truth about his brother's service. "When do I start?" Colonel Martinez's smile was warm and genuine. "Whenever you're ready. But first, we have a ceremony to plan. Derek's going to receive the recognition he deserved 12 years ago, and you're going to be there to accept it on behalf of your family." As they left the building an hour later, Tyler felt like he was walking in a different world than the one he'd inhabited that morning. The same streets looked the same buildings stood in their familiar places, but everything felt transformed by the knowledge that Derek's sacrifice was finally going to be acknowledged, that his heroism was going to be officially recognized, that his memory was going to live on in ways that went far beyond family stories and personal grief. The drive back to Riverside Coffee Company was quiet, but it was a comfortable quiet, the silence of people who had shared something profound and were still processing its implications. When they pulled up outside the coffee shop, Tyler was surprised to see that the crowd on the sidewalk had grown even larger. Word had apparently spread throughout Millbrook about the morning's events, and people had come to show their support for Tyler and their respect for Derek's memory. Jake was waiting outside the shop, his expression a mixture of pride and concern. "Tyler, there are reporters here. Someone called the local newspaper about what happened this morning, and they want to interview you about your brother." Tyler looked at the small group of people with cameras and notepads, then at Mac and Colonel Martinez. "What should I tell them?" "Tell them the truth," Colonel Martinez said. "Derek's story is going to become public anyway when the Medal of Honor ceremony is announced. This is your chance to make sure his story is told correctly, to make sure people understand what kind of man he was and what kind of sacrifice he made." Tyler nodded, squared his shoulders, and walked toward the reporters. As he did, the crowd on the sidewalk parted, creating a path for him. Mrs. Carter reached out and squeezed his arm as he passed. Tom, the firefighter, nodded approvingly, and several other people offered words of encouragement. The lead reporter was a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a professional demeanor. "Mr. Brooks, I'm Sarah Chen from the Millbrook Gazette. We understand that you had an incident here this morning involving your brother's military service. Would you be willing to share that story with us? Tyler took a deep breath, thinking about Derek, about the promise Mac had made, about the letter he carried in his jacket pocket. My brother Derek died 12 years ago in Afghanistan. He died saving the lives of 6 soldiers, but for political reasons his service was classified and his sacrifice was erased from the official record. This morning, for the first time in 12 years, I met someone who was there when Derek died, someone who could tell me the truth about what my brother did and why he died. The reporter scribbled notes quickly. Can you tell us about the incident in the coffee shop? Tyler glanced back at Mac, who nodded encouragingly. Some customers were making fun of my tattoo, which honors Derek's unit. They assumed I was lying about my brother's service, that I was trying to get sympathy or discounts by pretending to be related to a soldier. When I tried to explain that my brother had died serving his country, they told me that his death wasn't their problem, that their convenience was more important than my grief. How did that make you feel? Tyler was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. It made me realize that Derek didn't just die to save the lives of 6 soldiers. He died to protect the freedom of every American, including the freedom of those people to treat his sacrifice with disrespect. But it also made me realize that some battles are worth fighting, that some truths are worth defending, even when it's difficult. Another reporter called out a question. We understand that your brother's service is now being officially recognized. Can you tell us about that? Tyler looked at Colonel Martinez, who nodded. My brother is going to receive the Medal of Honor next month. His service is being officially acknowledged, and his sacrifice is being properly honored. But more importantly, his story is going to help other families who have been denied the truth about their loved one's service. What do you want people to know about your brother? Tyler touched his tattoo, feeling the wolf's head beneath his fingers. I want them to know that Derek Brooks was a hero, not because he died in combat, but because he chose to live his life putting other people before himself. I want them to know that heroism isn't about being fearless or perfect. It's about deciding that other people's lives matter more than your own safety. And I want them to know that the freedoms we enjoy every day, including the freedom to treat each other with respect or disrespect, were paid for by people like Derek, who believed those freedoms were worth dying for. Quote, the reporter looked up from her notes. What would you say to the people who were disrespectful to you this morning? Tyler considered the question carefully. I'd say that I forgive them, because Derek would have forgiven them. But I'd also say that respect isn't something you give because someone demands it. It's something you give because it's the right thing to do. And treating people with dignity, especially when they can't fight back, is one of the most basic ways we honor the sacrifice of the people who died to protect our freedom. As the interview concluded, Tyler realized that the morning had been more than just a chance encounter or a moment of recognition. It had been a transformation, a moment when he'd stopped being just Derek's little brother and had become something more. He was now the keeper of Derek's legacy, the voice that would speak for his brother's sacrifice, the advocate who would fight to make sure other families didn't have to endure 12 years of silence and erasure. The crowd began to disperse as the reporters packed up their equipment, but many people stayed to speak with Tyler personally. Mrs. Carter told him about her own husband's service in Vietnam, about the disrespect he'd faced when he came home, about the importance of honoring all veterans regardless of popular opinion about their wars. Tom the firefighter shared stories about the veterans he'd served with in the fire department, about the way combat experience translated into a willingness to run toward danger instead of away from it. A young woman Tyler didn't recognize approached him hesitantly. Mr. Brooks? My name is Amanda Walsh. My boyfriend is deployed overseas right now, and hearing your story, hearing about your brother's sacrifice, it helps me understand what he might be going through over there. Tyler shook her hand warmly. What's your boyfriend's name? Michael Chen. He's with the 82nd Airborne. Tyler smiled. Tell Michael that Derek Brooks is watching over him, and that there are people here at home who understand the sacrifice he's making. Tell him that his service matters, that his courage makes a difference, and that heroes like him are the reason the rest of us can live in freedom." Amanda's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you. That means more than you know." As the afternoon wore on, Tyler found himself having similar conversations with dozens of people. Veterans who shared their own stories of service and sacrifice, family members who had lost loved ones in combat, young people who were considering military service themselves. Each conversation reinforced his understanding of the role he was now called to play, the voice he was meant to be for those whose sacrifices had been forgotten or ignored. When the crowd finally thinned, Tyler found himself standing on the sidewalk with Mac, Jake, and Emma, looking back at the coffee shop that had been the site of so much drama and revelation in just one morning. "So what happens now?" Emma asked. "I mean, after all this, are you still going to work here?" Tyler looked at the familiar storefront, at the warm light spilling from the windows, at the place where he'd learned to connect with people from all walks of life. "For now," he said, "this job taught me how to talk to people, how to listen to their stories, how to make them feel welcome and valued. Those are going to be important skills for what I'm going to do next." Jake nodded approvingly. "You'll always have a place here, Tyler. And I meant what I said about the display honoring Derek and his unit. This shop is going to be a place where their sacrifice is remembered and their service is honored." Mac placed a hand on Tyler's shoulder. "Derek would be proud of how you handled yourself today. The way you stood up to those people, the way you spoke to the reporters, the way you connected with all these different people. You've got the same heart he had, the same courage, the same commitment to putting others first." Tyler felt the weight of Derek's legacy settling on his shoulders again, but this time it felt less like a burden and more like a calling. "I've got 12 years of catching up to do. 12 years of learning about the man Derek became after he left home. 12 years of understanding the sacrifice he made. But I think I'm ready to start." As they prepared to part ways, Mac handed Tyler a business card. "This has my contact information and the information for the other members of the Forgotten Company. We meet once a month just to share stories and support each other. You're welcome to join us anytime." Tyler pocketed the card, understanding that he was being invited into a brotherhood he'd never known existed, a community of people bound together by loss and love, and the unbreakable bonds of shared sacrifice. "There's one more thing," Mac said quietly. "Derek's personal effects, the things he had with him when he died. They were classified along with everything else, but now that his service is being recognized, they're going to be returned to your family, including some letters he wrote but never had a chance to send." Tyler felt his breath catch. "Letters to me? Letters to you? Letters to your parents? Letters to friends back home?" Derek was a writer, Tyler. He documented everything, wrote down his thoughts and feelings and experiences. You're going to get to hear his voice again, in his own words. The prospect of reading Derek's letters, of hearing his brother's voice across the gap of 12 years, was almost overwhelming. Tyler had thought that the morning's revelations were the end of his journey to understand Derek's service, but now he realized they were just the beginning. "When?" Tyler asked. "Soon," Mac promised. "Very soon. The Pentagon is expediting the release of all materials related to Derek's service. Within a few weeks, you'll have everything that was taken from your family 12 years ago." As Tyler walked home that evening, he thought about the strange turns life could take, the way a single morning could transform everything you thought you knew about yourself and your place in the world. When he'd woken up that morning, he'd been just another college student working a part-time job, trying to get by. Now he was the brother of a Medal of Honor recipient, the keeper of a classified legacy, the voice that would speak for families who had been denied the truth about their loved one's service. The tattoo on his arm, which had started the day as a source of mockery and derision, had become something powerful, something that connected him not just to Derek's memory, but to a larger community of people who understood the true cost of freedom. The wolf's head that had seemed like just a symbol of remembrance was now a declaration of belonging, a way of saying that some bonds couldn't be broken by death or distance, or the deliberate erasure of inconvenient truths. Tyler thought about the letter Mac had carried for 12 years, the promise Derek had made him make, the words of love and pride and hope that had waited so long to be delivered. He thought about the college fund that had been stolen by bureaucracy but was now being restored, about the recognition that had been denied but was now being granted, about the justice that had been delayed but was finally being served. Most of all, he thought about Derek, about the man his brother had become in those final years of his life, about the courage he'd shown and the sacrifice he'd made. Tyler had always known Derek was a hero, but now he understood that heroism wasn't just about the moment of death. It was about the choice to live every day putting other people first, choosing service over safety, choosing love over fear. As he reached his small apartment above the bookstore, Tyler pulled out his phone and called his parents. They deserved to know what had happened, deserved to understand that Derek's sacrifice was finally being recognized, that their son's service was going to be officially honored. The conversation was emotional, filled with tears and laughter, and the strange mixture of grief and joy that came with long-delayed justice. "He's finally coming home," his mother said through her tears. "After all these years, Derek is finally coming home." Tyler understood what she meant. Derek's body had been returned to them 12 years ago, but his spirit, his legacy, his true story had remained trapped in classified files and political expediency. Now finally, all of Derek was coming home. The hero, as well as the brother, the soldier, as well as the son, the man who had died saving others, as well as the boy who had taught Tyler to ride a bike and scared away the neighborhood bullies. That night, Tyler sat at his small kitchen table and began to write. He wrote about the morning's events, about meeting Mac, about learning the truth about Derek's final mission. He wrote about the confrontation in the coffee shop, about the way Brad and Jessica and Connor had treated Derek's memory, about the lesson he'd learned about respect and dignity and the true cost of freedom. But mostly he wrote about Derek. He wrote about the brother he remembered, the soldier he was learning about, the hero he was finally able to honor. He wrote about the tattoo that had started as a symbol of loss and was becoming a symbol of connection, about the promise that had been kept and the justice that had been served. As he wrote, Tyler felt Derek's presence in a way he hadn't, since his brother had left for deployment 12 years earlier. Not as a ghost or a memory, but as a living part of his own identity, a source of strength and purpose and direction. Derek's sacrifice had meaning, his heroism had purpose, and his love for his little brother had created a chain of connection that stretched across time and space and loss. Tyler touched the tattoo on his arm one more time before going to bed, feeling the wolf's head beneath his fingers. Tomorrow he would begin the work of honoring Derek's legacy, of speaking for families who had been denied the truth, of making sure that no hero's sacrifice was ever again erased by political convenience or bureaucratic indifference. But tonight, for the first time in 12 years, Tyler Brooks slept peacefully, knowing that his brother's story was finally going to be told, that Derek's sacrifice was finally going to be recognized, and that the promise made by a dying soldier in the sand of Afghanistan had finally, after all these years, been kept. 3 weeks later, Tyler stood in the mirror of his apartment bathroom, adjusting the collar of the dress uniform he'd never expected to wear. The navy dress blues had belonged to Derek, carefully preserved by their parents, and now altered to fit Tyler's slighter frame. The fabric still carried the faint scent of the cedar chest, where it had waited for 12 years, and wearing it felt like being embraced by his brother's memory. The Medal of Honor ceremony was scheduled for 11 o'clock at the Millbrook Community Center, a venue chosen specifically because Derek had graduated from Millbrook High School and had always spoken fondly of the town where he'd grown up. The decision to hold the ceremony locally rather than in Washington had been Tyler's, supported by Colonel Martinez and endorsed by the Pentagon as a way of emphasizing that heroes came from ordinary communities and that their sacrifices touched real people in real places. Tyler's hands shook slightly as he pinned Derek's unit insignia to the uniform jacket. The wolf's head emblem looked different now than it had as a tattoo on his arm, more official, more weighty with the recognition it had finally received. Beside it, he placed the bronze star and purple heart that Derek had earned but never received, medals that had been locked away in classified files until the truth about his service had finally been acknowledged. A knock at his door interrupted his preparations. Tyler opened it to find Max standing in the hallway, wearing his own dress uniform for the first time in over a decade. The older man looked distinguished in his military blues, the ribbon rack on his chest telling the story of a career spent in service to his country. But it was his eyes that struck Tyler most, bright with an emotion that seemed equal parts pride and relief. "You ready for this?" Mac asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Tyler nodded, touching the pocket where Derek's final letter rested against his heart. The Pentagon had released Derek's personal effects the previous week, and among them had been a sealed envelope addressed to Tyler, written in Derek's familiar handwriting. The letter had been Derek's final words to his little brother, written the night before the mission that would claim his life, and reading it had been both devastating and healing. The letter had contained everything Tyler had hoped for and more. Derek's pride in his little brother's academic achievements, his confidence that Tyler would accomplish great things, his love for the family they'd built together. But it had also contained Derek's fears about the mission, his awareness that not all of them might make it home, and his desperate hope that if something happened to him, Tyler would understand that his sacrifice had been made out of love for the people and principles he'd sworn to protect. "He knew," Tyler said quietly as they walked toward Mac's truck. Derek knew that mission was dangerous. He wrote in the letter that he had a bad feeling about it, but he went anyway because his men needed him. Mac nodded grimly. Derek always put his soldiers first. That's what made him such a good leader, and that's what made his loss so hard to bear. The Army lost more than a good soldier that day. They lost someone who understood that leadership was about service, not authority. The drive to the community center took them through the heart of Millbrook, past the coffee shop where everything had started, past the diner where Tyler had first learned the truth about Derek's final mission, past the high school where Derek had played football and dated cheerleaders and dreamed about his future. The streets were lined with American flags, placed there by community members who had learned about the ceremony and wanted to honor Derek's sacrifice. The community center parking lot was already full when they arrived, cars bearing license plates from across the region. Tyler recognized some of the vehicles, belonging to the other families in Mac's informal support group, the people who had been gathering quietly for years to remember the soldiers whose service had been officially erased. But there were many more cars than Tyler had expected, suggesting that word of the ceremony had spread far beyond the immediate circle of people directly affected. Inside the community center, Tyler was overwhelmed by the sight that greeted him. The main hall had been transformed into a formal military ceremony space, with rows of chairs facing a stage draped in red, white, and blue bunting. American flags flanked the podium, and a large screen displayed a slideshow of photographs from Derek's life, from childhood pictures through his military training to images from his deployment. But it was the people who filled the chairs that truly took Tyler's breath away. The front rows were occupied by men in military dress uniforms, some young and some middle-aged, all wearing the same solemn expression of respect and remembrance. These were the soldiers Derek had saved, Tyler realized, the 6 men who had gone home to their families because Derek Brooks had decided their lives were worth more than his own safety. Behind them sat the other families, the parents and spouses and siblings of the soldiers who hadn't made it home from that final mission. Tyler had met some of them during the previous weeks, people like Maria Santos, whose husband had died alongside Derek, and Robert Chen, whose son had been killed in the same IED explosion. They had welcomed Tyler into their community of grief and remembrance, sharing stories about their loved ones and drawing strength from their shared understanding of loss. The rest of the hall was filled with people Tyler had met during his 3 weeks of preparation for this moment. There was Dorothy from the diner, wearing her best dress and holding a small American flag. Tom the firefighter sat with his crew, all of them in their dress uniforms. Mrs. Carter had claimed a spot in the 3rd row, her expression proud and maternal, as she watched Tyler walk down the aisle. Perhaps most surprisingly, Jake had closed Riverside Coffee Company for the morning and brought his entire staff to the ceremony. Emma waved at Tyler from her seat, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Even some of the regular customers were there, people who had heard Tyler's story and wanted to pay their respects to the brother who had died protecting the freedoms they enjoyed every day. As Tyler made his way to the front row, he noticed 3 people conspicuously absent from the gathering. Brad, Jessica, and Connor were nowhere to be seen, their absence speaking louder than their presence might have. Their behavior 3 weeks earlier had become something of a local scandal, shared on social media and discussed in coffee shops and barbershops throughout Millbrook. The consensus seemed to be that they had revealed something ugly about themselves, something that had permanently damaged their standing in the community. Colonel Martinez approached Tyler as he took his seat, her expression warm but serious. "Tyler, I want you to know that this ceremony is being broadcast live to military bases around the world. Derek's story is going to reach thousands of service members who need to hear that their sacrifices matter, that their courage is recognized, that their service will never be forgotten." "Derek would have liked that," Tyler replied. "He always said that the military was one big family, that soldiers looked out for each other no matter where they served." The ceremony began with the presentation of colors by an honor guard from the local National Guard unit, followed by the national anthem performed by the Millbrook High School Choir. As the young voices filled the hall with the familiar words about the land of the free and the home of the brave, Tyler felt the weight of Derek's sacrifice in a new way. His brother had died to preserve the freedom those words represented, and now that sacrifice was finally being recognized in the community where Derek had learned the values that had guided his service. Colonel Martinez took the podium first, her voice strong and clear as she addressed the gathered crowd. "We are here today to correct an injustice that has persisted for 12 years. We are here to recognize the heroism of Staff Sergeant Derek Brooks and the other members of his unit who made the ultimate sacrifice in service to their country. But we are also here to acknowledge our failure to honor their service when we should have, to apologize to their families for the pain our silence has caused, and to ensure that such injustices never happen again." She spoke about the mission that had claimed Derek's life, about the intelligence operation that had required secrecy but not erasure, about the political considerations that had led to the suppression of the truth. Her words were carefully chosen, acknowledging the complexity of the situation, while making it clear that the decision to bury Derek's service had been wrong. Staff Sergeant Brooks and his fellow soldiers were not just casualties of war, Colonel Martinez continued. They were casualties of a system that prioritized political convenience over moral courage, that chose secrecy over honesty, that abandoned the families of fallen heroes when they most needed support. Today, we begin to make amends for those failures. Mac was the next speaker, his voice slightly hoarse with emotion as he recounted the events of Derek's final mission. He spoke about Derek's leadership, his courage under fire, his determination to save his fellow soldiers even at the cost of his own life. But he also spoke about Derek as a person, about the young man who had carried pictures of his family in his helmet, who had played guitar badly but enthusiastically, who had talked constantly about his little brother who was going to change the world. "Derek Brooks died as he lived," Mac said, his eyes finding Tyler in the front row. "Putting others before himself, thinking about his family and his fellow soldiers, believing that some things were worth any sacrifice. He saved 6 lives that day, but his influence reached far beyond those 6 men. He inspired everyone who knew him to be better, to care more, to serve with greater dedication and purpose." When it came time for Tyler to speak, he felt his legs shake as he approached the podium. The hall fell silent, hundreds of faces turned toward him in expectation. He had practiced his remarks dozens of times, but standing there in Derek's uniform, looking out at the people who had come to honor his brother's memory, the prepared words seemed inadequate. 3 weeks ago, Tyler began, his voice stronger than he had expected. I was just another college student working at a coffee shop, trying to figure out what I was going to do with my life. I thought I knew everything there was to know about my brother Derek, about the way he died, about the legacy he left behind. I was wrong. He spoke about the morning at Riverside Coffee Co., about the encounter that had changed everything, about meeting Mac and learning the truth about Derek's final mission. He talked about the letter Derek had written, about the love and pride and hope it had contained, about the way it had connected him to his brother across the gap of 12 years. Derek wrote that he hoped I would use my education to make a difference in the world, Tyler continued. He said he believed I had the intelligence and the compassion to help people, to fight for justice, to stand up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves. For 12 years, I didn't understand what he meant, but now I do. Tyler looked out at the faces in the crowd, at the veterans and family members and community supporters who had come to honor Derek's memory. Derek's sacrifice wasn't just about saving 6 soldiers, though that would have been enough. It was about preserving the values that make America worth defending, the freedom to speak truth to power, the courage to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult, the commitment to putting the needs of others before our own comfort or convenience. He spoke about the new commission that would bear Derek's name, about the work it would do to ensure that other families didn't endure 12 years of silence and secrecy. He talked about the responsibility he felt to honor Derek's legacy, not just through words but through actions, through service to the people who had been forgotten or ignored by the systems that should have protected them. Derek can't speak for himself anymore, Tyler concluded, his voice breaking slightly. But his voice lives on through the 6 soldiers he saved, through the families who finally have the truth about their loved one's service, through the commission that will fight to prevent future injustices. And his voice lives on through me, through the promise I'm making today to spend my life fighting for the values he died to protect. The presentation of the Medal of Honor was conducted with the full ceremony traditionally reserved for such occasions. A military chaplain offered a blessing. The citation was read aloud, detailing Derek's heroic actions, and Tyler accepted the medal on behalf of his family and all the people who had been touched by Derek's sacrifice. As Tyler held the medal in his hands, feeling its weight and seeing the way the light caught the star-shaped design, he thought about the journey that had brought him to this moment. 3 weeks earlier, Derek's heroism had been a family secret, known only to the people who loved him and hidden from official recognition by political expediency. Now it was being broadcast around the world, inspiring service members and families who needed to know that sacrifice was remembered and heroism was honored. The ceremony concluded with the playing of taps, the mournful notes filling the hall as the crowd stood in respectful silence. Tyler felt tears streaming down his face, but they were tears of closure rather than pure grief. Derek's story had finally been told, his sacrifice had finally been recognized, and his legacy was finally secured. As people began to file out of the hall, many stopped to speak with Tyler personally. The 6 soldiers Derek had saved approached as a group, their expressions a mixture of gratitude and sorrow. The oldest among them, a man in his 40s who now wore the stripes of a master sergeant, spoke for the group. "Tyler Brooks," he said formally. "My name is Master Sergeant James Martinez. Your brother saved my life 12 years ago, and not a day has passed since then that I haven't thought about his sacrifice. I want you to know that I have 2 children who are alive today because Derek Brooks decided my life was worth saving. I will make sure they know his name, his story, and the debt our family owes to yours." Similar conversations followed throughout the afternoon. Tyler met the wives and children of the men Derek had saved, people whose lives had been shaped by his brother's courage, even though they had never known his name. He spoke with other family members who had lost loved ones in the same mission, sharing grief and finding comfort in their shared understanding of loss. But perhaps the most meaningful conversation came when Tyler noticed a familiar figure standing awkwardly near the back of the hall. Brad Mitchell looked uncomfortable and uncertain, clearly unsure whether he should approach or simply leave. When he finally worked up the courage to walk over, his usual arrogance was nowhere to be seen. "Tyler," Brad said quietly, I know I don't have any right to be here, and I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. But I wanted you to know that I've spent the last 3 weeks thinking about what I said that morning, about how I treated you in your brother's memory. I was wrong. I was ignorant and cruel and completely out of line. Tyler studied Brad's face, seeing genuine remorse where arrogance had once lived. What changed your mind? I started reading about your brother, about what he did, about the men he saved. I learned that one of those soldiers, Sergeant Martinez, has a son who goes to my kid's school. I realized that my children get to play with his children because your brother decided to be a hero. It made me understand that my comfort, my convenience, my morning coffee, all of it exists because people like Derek are willing to sacrifice everything to protect it. Brad paused, struggling with words that clearly didn't come easily. I also realized that I've been raising my kids to think that their time is more valuable than other people's dignity, that their needs matter more than other people's feelings. That's not the kind of father I want to be, and it's not the kind of man your brother died to protect. Tyler extended his hand, and Brad shook it gratefully. Derek would have forgiven you, Tyler said. He believed that people could change, that everyone deserved a chance to be better than their worst moments. The question is whether you're going to use this chance to actually become a better person. I'm going to try, Brad said simply. I'm going to teach my kids that respect isn't something you give based on what someone can do for you. It's something you give because it's the right thing to do. And I'm going to make sure they know Derek Brooks' name and understand what he died for. As the afternoon wore on, Tyler found himself surrounded by people who wanted to share their own stories of military service, of family sacrifice, of the way Derek's example had inspired them to think differently about courage and commitment. A young woman approached him to say that watching the ceremony had convinced her to enlist in the Army. A veteran of the Vietnam War thanked him for helping to ensure that the current generation of warriors would be properly honored for their service. But it was Mrs. Carter who offered perhaps the most profound observation of the day. Tyler, she said as she prepared to leave, I've been thinking about what your brother accomplished, not just in the way he died, but in the way he lived. He didn't just save 6 soldiers that day. He saved the idea that ordinary people can do extraordinary things, that heroism isn't reserved for special people, but is available to anyone who chooses to put others first. As the community center emptied, and the formal ceremony gave way to informal conversations and shared memories, Tyler felt a profound sense of completion. Derek's story had been told, his sacrifice had been recognized, and his legacy was secure. But more than that, Tyler had found his own purpose, his own calling to continue the work Derek had started. The Brooks Commission would begin its work the following month, with Tyler serving as its civilian advocate and primary liaison with affected families. There were hundreds of cases to investigate, hundreds of families who had been denied the truth about their loved one's service, hundreds of injustices to correct. It would be difficult work, emotionally demanding and often frustrating, but it was work that mattered, work that honored Derek's memory by ensuring that future heroes' sacrifices would never again be hidden or forgotten. As Tyler drove home that evening, still wearing Derek's dress uniform, he thought about the strange journey that had brought him to this moment. A chance encounter with an entitled customer had led to a confrontation that had revealed the truth about his brother's service. That truth had led to recognition that was 12 years overdue, and that recognition had led to a calling that would shape the rest of Tyler's life. The tattoo on his arm, which had started this whole journey, felt different now than it had 3 weeks earlier. It was no longer just a symbol of grief or remembrance. It was a badge of belonging, a way of identifying himself as part of the community of people who understood that freedom wasn't free, that courage was a choice, and that some sacrifices echoed across generations. Tyler pulled into his parking space and sat for a moment in the quiet of his truck, looking up at the apartment where Derek's medal now rested on the mantelpiece, beside a framed photograph of the 2 brothers as children. Tomorrow he would begin the work of helping other families find the truth about their loved one's service. Next week he would travel to Washington to meet with Pentagon officials about expanding the Commission's mandate. Next month, he would speak at a conference of military families about the importance of transparency and recognition. But tonight, Tyler Brooks would sit in Derek's old room, reading the letters his brother had written but never sent, listening to his voice across the gap of 12 years, and planning the future Derek had always believed he would build. A future dedicated to service, to justice, to ensuring that heroes were honored, and families were supported, and sacrifices were never forgotten. Derek Brooks had died saving 6 soldiers, but his legacy was saving something much larger than that. He was saving the idea that ordinary people could do extraordinary things, that love was stronger than fear, that some promises were worth keeping no matter how long it took to fulfill them. As Tyler finally got out of his truck and walked toward his apartment, he felt Derek's presence not as a ghost or a memory, but as a living part of his own identity. The wolf's head tattoo on his arm seemed to pulse with life, connecting him to his brother, to the soldiers Derek had saved, to the families who had finally found justice, and to the countless people who would benefit from the commission that bore Derek's name. Tyler Brooks was no longer just a college student working at a coffee shop. He was the brother of a Medal of Honor recipient, the keeper of a heroic legacy, and the voice that would speak for families who had been denied the truth about their loved one's ultimate sacrifice. It was a heavy responsibility, but it was also a gift, a way of ensuring that Derek's death had meaning beyond the immediate lives he had saved. Standing in his apartment, looking at Derek's medal gleaming in the lamplight, Tyler made a silent promise to his brother. He would live the life Derek had died to protect. He would use the education Derek had wanted him to have. He would become the man Derek had always believed he could be. And he would make sure that no hero's sacrifice was ever again hidden by political convenience or bureaucratic indifference. Derek Brooks had come home at last, not just to his family, but to his rightful place in the story of American heroism. His sacrifice was finally recognized, his courage was finally honored, and his love for his little brother had finally found its purpose in the work Tyler would spend his life doing. The promise had been kept, the truth had been told, and the legacy would live on. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.